welcome to the Fourth Line Podcast Fantasy Show. That is right, the brand new Fourth Line Podcast Fantasy Show. With you today is myself, Carl, and welcome to the show, Mr. Ben Ferguson. How's it going, Ben?
Good, great. Thanks for having me. I appreciate the opportunity, and I'm hoping this takes off because this could turn into something big.
Yeah, we're gonna have a lot of fun. This is like a pilot episode. We don't even know if you will. I guess if you're listening to this right now, you know that it made the air. But we're just gonna see where this takes us. We're gonna play around with fantasy. Ben, you have like a big wealth of experience when it comes to fantasy, and particularly fantasy hockey. What's your background there?
It started, I think I played my first fantasy league in grade 9 or 10, and it happened to be a rotisserie. So it was very straightforward, just plug and play. You pick your players for the week and just let it roll. And then it started growing into I think I'm in 2 or 3 keepers at this point that have been spanning over the 6 or 7 years. One's 10 for sure. And then now daily fantasy. Daily fantasy is I would say my cornerstone, is something I really, really look into because it's quick, it's easy. It's 3 days a week for me, normally Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturdays. And it's methodical. There's no chaos. There's a reason for everything. Every pick, every dollar, the salary comes down to a huge play. And that's sort of what I want to bring, because it's a growing industry now. You see the legislation changing in the United States and daily fantasy becoming an acceptable thing in most of these states that had it banned. The popularity is just going to grow, and that's why I'm here. I want to help people make the most. If they're gambling on it, whether it's $1 to $100, I want to try and give them some insight and how they could grow a return, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. And it is incredibly growing. I know that's becoming arguably the biggest part of fantasy in general. You're seeing that, it started big in football, and now it's really growing into the other sports. And I think because that gives you more, like you say, you play Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday, that gives you opportunities to engage in a new and fresh way where, if you had a terrible draft or your number one pick in a standard format fantasy league goes out, this lets you jump back in. For me, I started playing fantasy hockey in 2007. So that was my first year. So 11 years ago, I finished second in my first league. Didn't win one until 2009. But I am the defending champ of the Fourth Line Podcast Hockey League. So I feel like I've peaked. I might just stop there. I might call it. You never know. But it's been a lot of fun. I've really changed my perspective on how I build a team and build a roster and kind of what I like in a fantasy league. So let's kind of start with how we like to set up our leagues and kind of what you expect. Let's start with the daily fantasy. When we're looking at daily fantasy, what are the statistics that we're going to be looking at? What are the actual numbers that will matter for evaluating players?
So the scoring is a little bit different than what you would see in a standard format. But the big thing, I guess you're looking at goals, assists, and then you have there's shorthanded points, shots, hits, and block shots. Block shots, to me, I think is I don't want to call it useless, but in fantasy when I think about fantasy, I think about high offense, lots of shots, lots of scoring. You want to up those numbers, and then when you have a category like that, it sort of sets you back because you have to find those guys that might generate these block shots. Like a big guy last year for me that I took in daily fantasy he was a machine was Alex Goligoski. He was I don't think I saw him break 3,500 salary once the whole entire season, but he was dynamite for that one category, was block shots. But yeah, it's you have to be able to target everything. Of course, goals are going to give you your 3 points per goal, which is big. And then your goaltending. Like if you could pick a goalie that sees a 25 save shutout over someone that sees, say, like a 37 save with allowing 4 goals and a loss, like you'll reap the rewards off that big time.
So when you say $3,500 budget, what kind of budgets are we typically using for daily fantasy?
So you start with 50,000 is your starting salary, and normally your typical stud like your Connor McDavid's, your Kucherovs, they'll sit anywhere between 6,700 and 7,300. The highest I've ever saw was Kucherov at 7,300, and that's for like if you think about it, you have to take because even in Pick'em, there's another league as well. What they'll do is they'll group together these high salaried players, and then you have to pick from I guess their tiers they call them. So you have your studs, and then you have your second tier will be like the guys that'll be like mid 6,000s, and then third will just keep stepping down like that until you get to sort of your sleeper utility players.
Right. So 7,300 would be kind of a peak. You're looking at about 7,000 of your 50. How many slots do we have to fill? Is it broken down like forwards, D, goaltenders? How is this kind of set up?
Yeah. So it's two for each. So it's two centers, two right wing, two left wing, two D, and then one goalie, single goalie.
Okay, and because coming from mostly a standard fantasy format, are you getting multiple position eligibility for these guys, or do they have one position they're eligible at?
Yeah, they're stuck with their position. It's not like Yahoo where you get lucky with someone that might be, say, like Jeff Carter speaking. He's last season. Or was it 2016? He was one of the rare ones with trial eligibility with center, left wing, and right wing, which made him an absolute he may have not got you 80, 90 points, but you could slot him basically anywhere.
Yeah, well, and that's a huge thing. That's how I typically like to build my roster, and we'll get into some of this as we go, but center is something that I typically try to steer clear from. Because unless you're picking, Connor McDavid first overall, which I did in both of my leagues last year, there's so many centers, and until they get that second eligibility, you're really going to be hamstrung if you're picking just centers. So for example, last year I had picked first overall, second round came around, and Stamkos was sitting there, and I was like, man, like looking at compared to who was there, I had to take him. Like there was no chance that I wasn't going to. But what really did hurt me the entire season was the fact that he was a center, and I was then left with these two guys running my centers, and really struggling to find anything else to put on my wings.
Yeah, it comes down to more like player management at that point, and the thing is, it's very rare that you have those nights where you don't have both those players playing, and then you're forcing another center to sit on the bench. And normally, like for most of the leagues I play in, it's two centers, two wings, or two separate or two left wings, two right wings, and then you have normally I've always done a two defensemen, then you could start two goalies generally.
Yeah, that sounds about right for what. I forget how many I can always double check here, how many positions we had. So last year in the fourth line league, we went, the same. We had two center, two left, two right, 4 D, and 2 goalies. So just a little bit more depth on D, and then, bench spots for the rest. So looking into this, where do you think that you put most of your time and energy? When you're looking at fantasy, are you putting it into your league format or into daily fantasy?
Early in the season, I'm putting it into daily fantasy just because it comes down to tendencies and almost matchups. And earlier in the year, you get these. If you do enough research and look into it, you get these teams that are unsettled. Like if last year when it was, or near the beginning, lots of people didn't just completely forgot about guys like Thomas Vanek, who early in the season, he dropped 12 points in 9 games. And if you could consistently have him on your a guy like that on your lineup with low ownership, you'll reap the rewards. Because like when the big thing is, it's just like daily fantasy football. Everybody's going to take your Le'Veon Bells. Everybody's going to take your Ezekiel Elliott's. Everybody's going to take your Tom Brady, stuff like that. But if you can find these hidden gems right away, same thing goes with the year-long fantasy. If you could find that guy that might you pick him up on a waiver out of nowhere, and he'll generate you points that hand over fist if everything works out. But And it really depends. If, like you said, if I have a good draft and all my players are healthy, knock on wood, I hope that happens this year because it didn't last year or the year before. But I'll devote most of my energy to that if I know I have a chance at taking it all. But for the most part, it's daily fantasy. It's every single day I'll be looking at just lineups and the practicing and everything because even like power play, penalty kill, like even those guys that are on the penalty kill, they may not be the best players, but they're always worth a look.
Yeah. So, and that's one thing that is very interesting. That there's a lot of different things, and you get to build a new team every day, so you get to figure it out. What's your go-to site for DFS?
Go-to site, I would say, actually NHL.com. Pete Jensen, he does an excellent job, and normally what it'll be is sort of he'll give you a buy low and sort of a spend up person for each position, normally on the bigger slate days on Tuesday, Thursdays, and Saturdays. But generally, like I'll just sort of formulate my own and go off my own research because I do end up writing articles during the hockey season, and most of my research that I do that go into the articles go into my roster formulation. So
sorry, when I say go to site, where do you play? What's your site that you play on?
Oh, sorry, DraftKings for sure. It's my go-to. I don't go anywhere else as of right now. There may be different options down the road, but I haven't come across any that rival or even come close to the way DraftKings is run and the way it's put together.
Well, and I think it was just last year, Yahoo, which is where I play my year-long fantasy for hockey. They added a daily option, and I haven't seen too many people use it. That DraftKings is still, to me, the number one. I just wanted to make sure we were on the same page there. You're a Yahoo guy for your year-long leagues?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. I don't think there's another site that I would go to. Even I think I did one through ESPN, and the fact that they had the opportunity to put penalty minutes. Or it was an auto, like they put that as an automatic category, just kind of threw me off. And I was like, this is the first and last time I'm going to be using this site.
Yeah, I played one just to be curious. ESPN is where I play my football, but baseball and hockey, I am a Yahoo guy. Penalty minutes, when I started, again, I've been playing this now 11 seasons of fantasy, all of them on Yahoo. Penalty minutes at the time was still a thing. What are your yearly? So for me, in the league that we used last year, we had our categories were goals, assists, power play points, shots, and hits. And then for goalies, it was wins, goals against, save percentage, and shutouts. What's your go-to? Because like me, I've moved away from the penalty minutes because I also agree that you should not reward someone for something that's a negative. And I went replacing it with hits. And there's a lot of different things. I'm not a fan of having too many categories because then you can have that niche guy, like a face-off. You put face-offs in, there's that weird face-off specialist who gets a ton and doesn't really bring you anything else, but it's going to win you. If you're playing categories, he's going to win you that category every single week. And to a lot of people, they won't have any idea that that's a thing they should be watching for, right? They're like, well, of course I'm going to take, Alexander Ovechkin 3rd or 4th overall. When you're like, well, he's not going to get you any face-offs, so you lose a category immediately, right? That's a way that you're really skewing centers even more so.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can look at it right now. So it's similar to yours, but we actually have, you mentioned face-off wins. We actually have that in our league, but that's sort of, we call it our pivot. So what we'll do is before our league starts, we'll vote on whether we want to keep that or move it to something else. So it's kind of and this is a redraft. It's not a keeper or anything, but we have goals, assists, points, plus minus, power play goals, power play assists, power play points, and then face-off wins and hits and shots, of course. And then we actually have a gold, or for our categories, we have a loss category. Because the big thing is, like, if you don't have that loss category, you could just keep firing goalies out there, right, to try and push that win column up. If you were that far behind and say goals against and save percentage, you could sort of just go on a whim and hope that you maybe steal a win or two with terrible stats.
And I 100% have been one who does that. I'm not opposed to adding that. I might go and add the losses to the league this year. What's the reasoning behind multiple power play numbers there? Because to me, I look at it and in having total points, you have already counted it once. Is there a reason why you want to have that when because what percentage of you list off a bunch. I missed the count, but what's the count on how many of your forward categories or skater are power play versus not?
It'd just be goals, assists, and overall points. So that'd be 3. You have 3 points. And then the thing is, the power play points doesn't play into your plus minus. So that's another thing. And then, so it's a little bit different because we have 13 categories. So we were going to eliminate
13 skater or 13 overall?
Oh, 13 overall in total. So there's 10 categories that aren't power play related.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would switch away from personally, because in having goals and assists, it's the same reason that I don't have total points. Because if you have goals and assists, you're counting those once already, and then count them a third time. Seems like it's skewing it a little bit. But I also try to get away from having, we're running 9 categories right now, so I'm running a lean set of stats. Trying to keep it as open and friendly as possible so that someone who's, this is my first time playing fantasy. I don't want it to be something, especially for for our listener league that we do. I want it to be something that anyone can jump into for the first time and have a fighting chance. Right. Which I assume your redraft league is probably a long time running thing.
Yeah, it's been going on for a while. Sometimes we'll lose someone for say a season, maybe they have to attend to something, and then we'll find a replacement, but we tell them it's you'll be in for this one season, and then we'll bring the other person in. So we're all very familiar with each other, and we've discussed changes. Some people are it's good the way it is, but who knows? Maybe I've always been open to eliminating some of the redundancies, like you said, with the power play points and the goals and assists, because if you think about it, you're counting it 3 times, It could actually shake up the league because we've all been in it together. We know each other's tendencies. We all know when it comes to trade tendencies, drafting tendencies, and stuff like that. We know each other fairly well. Maybe a change is what's needed to sort of shake up the standings because the same 4 people have been in the Final Four for the last 3 seasons. So it's sort of
it's time to change things up.
Yeah.
Actually, there was a league that I was in with Joel previously. Let me see if I can find it here to get the exact number. Because I joined this league with him, and I won it 1, 2, 3, 4 years in a row. 4 years in a row. I won the league 4 years in a row, and I said, it was a keeper league. I said, I'm sick of winning this league. I am done. And there is something to keeping it where it's open to it. And that's something that I think fantasy football gives that because there's a lot more randomness to player performance than there would be in hockey. If you even a first round running back, right? You're taking Lev Bell, there's a chance he's going to get hurt. There's a chance he's going to underperform. There's a lot of factors that go into it. If you're taking Connor McDavid first overall, even last year, which was an underperforming year, he still finished as someone you should have probably taken first overall. He still was able, he wasn't going to run away and win you a championship, but he was still very good. So, I'm all for finding ways to shake it up because that is a great way to just keep things fresh, keep it interesting so that you want people to keep coming back to that. Very important question though. Are you one of those 4 that keep making it in the Final Four?
I am. I won the first season and I won last season. Thanks to a big surge from, like I said, these character guys like Thomas Vanek and James Van Riemsdyk. The end of the season that he put on was absolutely stellar. I think he had 12 goals in the last 15 games or something ridiculous like that. And it didn't come down to any of my studs. It didn't come down to my like McDavid. Well, McDavid helped, of course. I'm not going to say he didn't, but when you're going up against a guy in the playoffs, when they have Ovechkins or Kucherovs, they sort of eliminate each other because they're both playing at such a high level. You sort of they're a wash. But yeah, I'm hoping to make it. I've never won in any fantasy back-to-back leagues, in whether it's rotisserie or standard or keeper or redraft. I sort of want to do that this year, so I plan on putting a little bit of extra effort into a little research over the next couple weeks here, and hopefully I could draft a winning team.
Let's hope that your league, don't tell them about this podcast yet. Don't tell them, because you want to keep those things secret.
Yeah, absolutely. I won't let it slip.
Well, let's get into some of what we want to touch on. Every week we'll be talking, or whenever we do the show, we'll be talking about some of what's happening, some of the news. If there's, a big player goes down, what are you going to do to replace player X? Who's a good player to pick up if you're playing full-time leagues? Who's a hot commodity? Who should you be looking at to add? Maybe previewing the upcoming games for DFS and looking into some of that. And we wanted to start by looking at some of the players to watch in this coming season, and particularly one division. Ben, you kind of had some thoughts on that.
Yeah, the Atlantic division is going to be, I think, is going to be one of the most interesting divisions, to be honest, because you have, it's seen a fair share of its. Well, I don't want to say a facelift, but in a sense, it has. Like, lots of the experts are saying to watch out for Florida, and I absolutely agree with it. I think they have the best second line in the NHL. I won't even say within the Eastern Conference or within the Atlantic. I'll say it in the entire NHL at this point. And not only on actual hockey, but fantasy purposes as well. I wouldn't be surprised to see Florida's top six easily, all six of them put up more than 50 points. And that can be coming through power play. That could be coming even strength. Like, they're going to be a powerhouse team. But another team I want to look at within the Atlantic, Montreal. Lots of people, I think, are going to sort of move away from and not be interested at all. I'm still highly sold on Carey Price. I don't care what anybody tells me. I'll go to my grave saying that Carey Price should be one of your first goaltenders taken in any format, whatever it is. He may have played absolutely terrible last year, but that was an anomaly in his career. You look at every single season leading up to that and beforehand, if he hadn't got injured, I think he would have put up pretty standard numbers, similar numbers than he has in the past 5 seasons. And then, go ahead.
No, keep going.
And then Buffalo as well. Like, they have a big facelift. I don't think Rasmus Dahlin is going to be the player that everybody makes him out to be, just because he is a defenseman. And defensemen, I particularly draft them solely based on power play production. And are they going to move Ristolainen out of that first spot for Dahlin? Probably not. Maybe later in the season if they're struggling and they want to sort of get him the reps and get him the ice time that he needs to develop. But for all we know, he could spend a year in the minors still, or plays 4 or 5 games up here and then be sent down. Another thing, Ottawa is just, I have no comments for them. Even with Kachuk going there, like, they don't really have much. Maybe Craig Anderson might be a bright spot in there, but even so, you're not going to get any wins from him. You might get a Fedod shutout because he just stands on his head. And then
let's camp on some of these for a second. So Florida, I think last year you looked at some of what they had. And you look at their team, they do have a lot of guys who are able to produce, quality stats. And when it comes to having a team that's incredibly deep, but not necessarily have a number one guy, right? Like, to a lot of people, they still don't really look at Barkov as a huge piece. And I think we're to some, the pendulum has swung so far. They're like, Barkov's underrated, and you're like calling him the 5th best center in the league. I'm not going that far. Like, I am not one of those who think that he is, but he's good. And the rest of that team certainly can put up numbers. Even, you saw Keith Yandel is a guy that if you're drafting defenseman, that's a guy I'm looking at, right? Like, he puts up the numbers, power play and not. He is a guy that I would want on my team. And I think you're going to see some of that those depth teams are the ones that are hit or miss, right? Because they can oscillate so much how their performance is because of usage. If a guy drops down to another line, or you have that depth and they get taken off the power play, for example, right? You're starting to lose a lot of that value that they once had. I don't see that happening in Florida, really. So that's good. What thoughts?
I think absolutely. And another player that sort of lots of people forget about is Mike Matheson, like another really young defenseman out of Florida. Like he just sort of slipped. He existed last season, and he put up numbers that lots of people would be surprised. So last year he put up 27 points in 81 games. It's like nothing to shit. It's not great, but it's not poor by any means. And near the end, they started to utilize him on the power play. He got four, like in his last 9 games, there was 4 power play points, and he amounted to 167 shots, which is it's above average for most defensemen, especially not playing first line power play and not playing first line D pairing. And that's another guy. Lots of people will they look at the first pairing and then completely just move on. Another guy, he's not an Atlantic, but similar how I could put him in the exact same thing as Mark-Edward Vlasic. Like, you hear the name getting called when you're watching games on TV, but he's so undervalued and underappreciated. But the returns he provides is just by having him on the roster. You can pick him up late. I guarantee next season you'll probably be able to find him on the waivers. He'll go undrafted in, say, a 12, 14-man league. And
and those are the kind of guys that you're looking at as like a good waiver pick. Like that, Vlasic's, again, it's something where I will own him on my team. At some point in the year, he'll probably be dropped, and I'll be watching again when he has a good schedule coming up or something like that. I'm going to be adding him back up. Buffalo, where are you going to be slotting in Dahlin? Where do you think you should be drafting him? So let's say you're playing a 12-team league. What round would you be looking at him in?
Well, that'd be tough because it really depend on. You'd have to look at the rest of the league and how in the direction they're going, because you get some of these guys, if they're really deep on defensemen already early. Like lots of people are content with just having, say, like a Hedman and then following it up with, say, a second-tier defenseman, not necessarily your stud like a Carlson or like a Burns or something like that. And then you might be able to get, like, you may drop to one of the last rounds. But for me, I personally wouldn't even draft him. If I had the opportunity, if he landed to me at the very last round, I probably wouldn't. And it's so hard to say because there's so many different circumstances. I would have to have that situation placed right in front of me at this moment, looking at the draft board and be like, do I take him or because at that point you're taking situational players or niche players, like you said, that really hone in on our one or two categories at that point.
But there is no chance that he's getting that far in any draft. No, even as a defenseman, right? Defensemen typically get drafted later. If you're playing in that, like if we use your league or the fourth line league, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 16. We had 16 players in our draft last year, so that's 18 rounds. If you're playing in a 12-team league, that's like 200 or so total. There's no chance that he's not being included as the top 200 projected valued players. And even just the name gets you drafted very high in fantasy. In most leagues, I would assume that there is no way that Dahlin gets out of the top half of a draft. So if you're looking at, the first 8 rounds, because, looking at this draft last year, if we're looking at defensemen drafted in the 8th round of our 16-team league, or our 16-round draft last year, we're talking Justin Schultz and Justin Falk. Now, if you're sitting there and you're like, well, who has the higher upside of those two? Who am I going to take a chance on? I would be taking Dahlin over those two for sure, just because there's potential for more. And the deeper it goes, the more I'm drafting off of ceiling and not based off of floor, right? I want that high upside guy who, sure, maybe I could drop him. most likely from rounds, the bottom quarter of my draft is going to be dropped at some point during the season, if not more. The bottom third of my draft, I'm like, all right, these guys might get dropped at some point, but I want the best shot at a high ceiling guy. I'm taking Dahlin for sure in the start of the second half of my draft, if not sooner.
Yeah, absolutely. Like I agree. It's just for me right now, it really depends who's left on the board, because I've seen some goofy stuff happen in the last couple of years in drafts. You just see these guys slide and slide and slide, and then you're given a situation where you sort of you skip out on someone and you kick yourself. It's happened before to me. I'm sure it's happened to lots of people in drafts. You sort of just assume that they're going to be
every year that happens, right?
Almost every round, I would say, like someone just because live chat and stuff, and people will be like, "Oh, I was banking on taking the next round." It's like, well, you can't do that, especially in any of these like paid leagues where every draft, like a bad draft, is detrimental. It doesn't take much to sort of put you at a disadvantage. But yeah, like I'm going to be keeping a close eye on ESPN and Yahoo and through the NHL site just to see where some of these guys are getting drafted. I'm going to be really, really interested to see where Zadina goes too. It'll be Dahlin and Zadina, because you have, like most of these scouts and stuff are toting him to have an Ovechkin-esque sort of style of play, which could be fantasy gold. You might be able to find him late in a draft, or not late, but later than your standard left wings. And that's the thing. Left wings are it's a tough position, because there's so few, I find, that are strong enough to make a big splash, aside from your standard, like you have your Patrick Laines and then your Ovechkins and Marchands, but after that, there isn't a whole lot going on.
Yeah. For what it's worth, NHL.com, they released rankings just last week, actually, some preseason rankings. And for what it's worth, they have Dahlin 71st overall, sandwiched right between Gostisbehere and the aforementioned Keith Yandel. So that's approximately, that would be round 7. So I was saying round 8 is about where I'd be starting to look for him. So he'd probably be gone off the board at that point, but that's where they have him. And as you said, more sites are going to start coming out with their preseason rankings, and most people typically just draft off of those rankings, which is another thing. Unless you're in an experienced league, those rankings dictate a lot. There was one year, I do not remember what year it was, but I'm just trying to think back. Nick Backstrom, for whatever reason, there was one year it was Nick Backstrom. There was another year that it was Brad Richards. And they were ranked like 200th overall by Yahoo, and they ended up being like 15th overall. And it's like, there's no reason to think that he should be that low. But for whatever reason, Yahoo let that slip through the cracks. And a lot of people won a lot of leagues that year because they realized that Nick Backstrom has never been a 200th overall player, and he will not be again. So let's go. Oh yeah, Carey Price. I 100%. Carey Price is a good selection there. You should take him as one of the first 5 goaltenders off the board, I'd say. Would you? That's kind of the realm I'm looking at there.
Absolutely. Like in Yahoo, he was the first goalie, like across what I'm looking here, even through ESPN and NHL, he was the first goalie to go. So I don't think, I think you could throw Braden Holtby. I don't know if you want to throw him back in there because he performed well in the playoffs. You can't take that away. But regular season, he was atrocious. For being the second goalie off the draft board in most of the leagues, he did not perform at all. But the big thing, one of my colleagues asked me if Cam Talbot, whether it's to take a risk on him. I'm not sold on him, but like we saw 2 seasons ago when the Oilers made their playoff run, he was able to put up those big save games and provide wins on top of it. And he could be a dark horse candidate for me, maybe once he gets going and once camps fire up. But to me, I just don't see him being a goalie I look to. But if I were to give you my top 5, my 5 right now, Price will be number 1. And then I'm going Pekka Rinne just for strictly wins. I'm sort of worried about Saros sort of dipping into his play share, considering Rinne is injury prone. Tuukka Rask, Matt Murray, and I'll throw Holtby in there too. Like those goalies are should be sought after early, and if you could pick them up early, that'd be great.
So like looking at my number one. The more I look at this list, I'm wrong. Carey Price is probably not in my 5. He's up there, but probably not in my 5, because my number one goaltender, also shooting for wins and just being really good, is Vasilevsky. Right, so I'm going him. That's my first goalie off the board. Other guys I'd be putting in my top 5. Bobrovsky. I'm putting in Braden Holtby. Probably going to go Matt Murray again. The shooting for wins there. If I'm shooting for wins as well, I'm going Freddie Anderson. Those are probably my top 5. If I listed 5, I think I did. I had Vasilevsky, Murray, Holtby, Bobrovsky, and if I did Anderson, Rask would be 6.
Yeah.
So like I'm probably putting Price 10 or later at this point, because if we're shooting for wins, Montreal is not something that's going to give us that this season. And especially if you're playing with the loss category, that's going to hurt you even more. So if you're Price, I do expect to have a bounce back from the ratio stats for sure. He can get you some shutouts, which is kind of a crapshoot random stat anyways. I do not have Carey Price. Looking through, Carey Price is not in my top 5.
Yeah, it's almost going on a hunch on my side. But like I said, it'll really depend, because preseason can tell a lot. I'm going to be interested to see if he actually plays or dresses for any preseason games. Because even so, and that's another big problem, is do they play him in the preseason just for the risk of injury? Because it's just sort of like preseason NFL. You see these guys going down for season-ending injuries. But I think my 5 will change, but it'll probably stay pretty close to what I listed off there, unless there's a massive injury, which, knock on wood, that never happens. Because as a sports fan, even if so-and-so, whoever I'm playing that week, suffers an injury, it hurts sports fans to see a star player go down, regardless if it's just one of those things.
Yeah, I think unless you're like a direct rival of that team, you're like, I never celebrate someone getting hurt, but you're like, okay, I'm okay not having to face against Carey Price all season, which I think is a fair thing. Toronto obviously is going to have a lot of guys at the top of every draft board, with Auston Matthews being up there, the addition of John Tavares, the aforementioned Freddie Anderson. Lots of guys at the top of draft boards. What are you thinking? Where are you sliding? Because I think Matthews and Tavares are going to be very close to each other on draft boards. Who are you taking first?
I'll take Matthews. I think, it's going to be weird because I haven't seen any lineup. Normally I'll check and see where projected lineups, and they have Matthews still centering the first line. But where the change may or may not come is there. You always read these rumors and whatnot, but there could be a potential of seeing Nylander moved for a defenseman, which Toronto needs desperately. And where they're going to look at that, it would be, say, like St. Louis or something like that, and then that'll just shake up the lines. But I think Matthews, I would take Matthews over Tavares if given that opportunity, sitting at the draft board with that pick in hand. I think his upside is far, far superior.
I think that's probably it, is that I look at whose ceiling is higher, and I'd say Matthews is higher. Tavares is the safe choice, and I'm okay taking the safe choice at the top of a board. So I would probably go Tavares, but it's borderline a coin flip for me. Looking at the rest of the teams in that division, not a lot to get excited about from some of them. But let's look at let's go head over to the Detroit Red Wings. Oh, you mentioned the centers. Let's stick with the centers for a second. Erik Karlsson, obviously the big piece to draft from there. And then a lot of unknowns, right? Matt Duchene had a very good second half of the season, a not so hot start to his time in Ottawa. And I think for a lot of these guys, these are players that I am possibly hoping get traded. Right? So, they start to have that. But the great thing is that if someone does get traded, ice time aplenty for the players that stick around in Ottawa as the season goes on. And as these things happen, that's something that becomes very important. The terrible teams who manage to toss out ice time to players, someone has to play. Someone is going to score goals in Ottawa this year. Someone is going to score goals for the Vancouver Canucks. Someone's going to score goals. It's probably going to be Bo Horvat and Brock Besser. But those are someone has to, right? So you look at these teams. New York Islanders, Jordan Eberle, going to score some goals this year because someone has to do it. Mm-hmm. And that's the situation I look at in Ottawa.
I think what it'll be is they've got some young guys on that roster. Like, you still have Jean-Gabriel Pageau, who showed flashes of greatness. Like, he had streaks where I was surprised. I don't know. Like, I'm sure I'm not alone in saying that some guy off the third line in Ottawa was scoring goals on top of goals on top of goals. And then you have the addition of Brady Tkachuk. And then you still got Mark Stone there. And Bobby Ryan, he's lightning in a bottle. It's just, does he show up? And that's another big thing, is potential trade bait, because if he gets traded, he's probably going to go with Karlsson with the contract. That was one of the things I think that was pitched around at this past trade deadline, was Ryan was going to be packaged with Karlsson. But say if he ends up on a Golden Knights or the Avs somehow, or somewhere where he could thrive and fit into their system, he could be an excellent player, and you could probably pick him up for dirt cheap.
Yeah, well, let's head to, again, another bad team. You mentioned Zadina. I would say other than Zadina, the only guy I'm looking at drafting off the Red Wings is Dylan Larkin. Is there any reason to be excited or to be looking at anyone else on the Red Wings roster?
At this point, no. Maybe you might get a little bit of utility out of Mike Green. He had a few good stretches of few good games, but aside from that, he doesn't really provide you much. His plus minus is terrible. He didn't really actually get a whole lot of power play time, and he was giving you shots. That was a big thing. And then when you're getting shots from a guy like that, like a defenseman, it gives you that opportunity, or you're hoping maybe 2 out of however many shots find twine, or they pick up a sloppy assist or something like that. But drafting him strictly on a possibility isn't worth it. I would say you could probably, or Tyler Bertuzzi, sorry. That's a guy I would be willing to draft, actually. Maybe late, or maybe acquiring him through waivers, but he'd be one of those guys that I think is going to fly under lots of people's radars, just because they are the Detroit Red Wings. They've sort of become irrelevant after Datsuk left.
Yeah, and a guy that you're okay taking a late round flyer, because if he isn't good, you can drop him.
Exactly.
Boston Bruins, a team that a lot of the guys on this team are the ones that we know for fantasy. We know that Brad Marchand should be up there. What changed last year, David Pastrnak has now moved into what I would say is a bona fide first round pick. That's a guy that you should be looking at taking. If you want him, do not wait, right? Like, if you're drafting at the turn of your draft, you probably will not have him come second round. So that's a guy who last year you could wait a little bit longer. But again, Tuukka Rask is one of those first goalies that's going to be coming off most boards. Any kind of guys you could be looking at with a little bit of upside in Boston this year?
They're actually a really interesting team, because you could either, what I saw was it was either Pastrnak went or Marchand went. And I think this year, now that Marchand proved that he put up numbers like crazy, sure, he's still the same player taking penalties and whatnot, but on the power play, those three between Bergeron, Pastrnak, and Marchand were deadly. And believe it or not, there was times when their pricing, especially in daily fantasy, was so low, I was able to get all three of them in a stack. And if they're all contributing on a single goal, you're pumping. You're reaping the benefits, threefold essentially. But Ryan Donato is someone that you should be looking at. Jake DeBrusk, and of course Charlie McAvoy. Those three for me, outside of your Bergeron, Pastrnak, and Marchand should be guys that should be on your radar at all time. Oh, and as well, Danton Heinen as well.
Yeah, and those are some guys that you can look at later in your drafts to be able to be on that board. Going to the last team, a team that is certainly filled, as is Boston, filled to the brim with top-line talent. Tampa Bay Lightning. You've got Nikita Kucherov, first-round pick, Steven Stamkos, first or second-round pick, and probably for me, Vasilevsky, if you're wanting him, you're taking him in the second round as well. So those are the top guys. Obviously, Victor Hedman is going to be one of the first defensemen off the board as well. So these are, stacked rosters. And again, a team where the depth on this roster continues to perform year in and year out, where I'm looking at taking some of these guys. For me, JT Miller last year was a beast. Well, obviously he was, right? Going to Tampa, he had 10 goals, 8 assists in 19 games to finish out the regular season. If you picked him up after the trade deadline thinking JT Miller is going to Tampa and he is going to do great things, you reaped the rewards from that. For at the time, JT Miller on a lot of leagues could have maybe been picked up on waivers. He wasn't 100% owned or anywhere close to that. He was a guy that in one of my leagues, I managed to pick him up off waivers. And that's a guy that I'd be looking at this year and saying, I want a piece of JT Miller.
Oh yeah, absolutely. That was, if you were to able to get him somehow, he definitely would have turned a season around no matter how bad your team was. This team is loaded, and even guys like Mikhail Sergachev, he was top 10 in the league for plus minus for goalies, for defensemen, sorry. And he didn't get a whole lot of time, because when you're playing behind Hedman, by far I would say one of the top 3 defensemen in the league, and he'll continue to be so until the duration or a catastrophic injury. But he did so well, and the fact that he's playing behind a guy like Hedman, I think having him, even if you do have Hedman, you could go ahead and have both of them on your roster and not have to worry. Another thing, Braden Point, even guys like Yanni Gourde, he played the most of the season on the third line, but he got that power play time, which is that's the biggest thing in fantasy, I think, is power play exposure. And they just parked in front of the net and you just score goals. The guy was basically, you could say he was a natural goal scorer, which he was, because everything went in off him, whether it was intentional or not. But I think there might be, if Karlsson's going to go somewhere, this might be the team that because they have the extra players to move. Like, you could very well see a guy like Yanni Gourde or like Sergachev go to Ottawa in return for Karlsson, because they just have the young guys there, they have the pieces, and from a fantasy perspective, it would just be absolutely ridiculous to have Karlsson and Hedman on the same team. It would just be nonsense.
And at the same time, I would want to have any player, whether it be from Tampa or not, heading to Ottawa. I would be wanting to pick those guys up, looking into seeing what they can get from that extra ice time in Ottawa. So if there's anyone rumored, jump on it. Obviously, we've seen through the summer, Erik Karlsson rumors, not the strongest thing to put your faith in, but it looks like, if they're smart, after seeing John Tavares walk for nothing, they should probably move Erik Karlsson.
Oh, they got to do something, because that's the thing. It's just like anything. You have to try and get a return on something that you hold on to, because players, just like anything, depreciate, and there's not necessarily the value tied to it from coming from, like, say, like a financial background. But if you just let it sit and sit and sit, and you're basically giving away things for free, because it's one of those loyalty things. If they want to keep you, they'll sign you, and if you don't want to sign, then it's dangerous for teams.
For sure, absolutely. Well, any last thoughts before we wrap up this pilot first shot at this episode?
Oh no, I appreciate the opportunity, and I hope we're able to help a few people out. It's a little bit difficult this early in the season, because you don't really get to see a whole lot of live action. You get to see all it is basically speculation and rumors. So hopefully we can provide something a little bit more in depth and contacts in the weeks coming up.
Absolutely. Well, you can find Ben. If you are new to his work, you can find him on Twitter at WCS_BFerg. You can find us on Twitter at Fourth Line Podcast. Head over to the fourthlinepodcast.com where you can find more. Who knows what we will be bringing for fantasy. Stay tuned for announcements on our listener league. That'll be showing up at some point this summer. And until next time, thank you, Ben. It was a lot of fun.
Thank you for having me.